Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today is Sunday, March 8, 2026, and we're really thrilled to have you here with us.
Oh, absolutely. The energy is high today. So glad you're tuning in.
It really is.
Okay.
But before we jump right into the data, we do want to take just a brief second to acknowledge what's happening globally.
Right, the situation overseas.
Yeah, specifically the really tense ongoing events between the USA, Israel, Iran, and just the broader Middle East right now.
It's incredibly heavy to watch.
It is. And look, we're not here to take sides on this deep dive. We just want to impart a very sincere, unified message that the world really needs to embrace peace and diplomacy rather than leaning into war.
Here. Peace has to be the priority. Our thoughts are definitely with everyone hoping for some stability right now.
Perfectly said.
Yeah.
So bringing things back home, the landscape here in Canada is also shifting in some pretty monumental ways.
It's basically a complete architectural reset of the system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But before we unpack that, a massive thank you to all of you listening right now. The engagement on our last deep dive, the one where we discussed if IRCC is using AI to refuse immigration applications.
Oh man, the comments on that one were phenomenal.
Just off the charts. Your debates and shared experiences are exactly why this deep dive exists. We're here to cut through the noise for you.
And that engagement is the absolute lifeblood of this analysis. So please, we implore you, keep commenting, hit that like button, and share the podcast so others can benefit from these discussions.
Yes, please do. And, you know, in that last edition, we actually asked you to drop comments suggesting what we should tackle next.
And the response was overwhelmingly pointing in one specific direction.
Unanimous, really. Which brings us to today's breaking focus. Canada is planning permanent residency for 33,000 temporary workers.
It's a massive story.
Huge. We're going to completely break down Canada's massive 2026 to 2028 immigration reset, looking at exactly what these new targets mean for workers, for students, and for your local communities.
So drop your thoughts in the comments below to keep this discussion going, and let us know what world or Canadian happenings you want us to dive into next.
And a really quick note for you guys, if you have a business and you want to advertise your products on the Deep Dive, just reach out with a detailed message to deepdive247@gmail.com.
That's deepdive247@gmail.com. All right, let's get into the mechanics of this policy.
Let's do it. To really understand this headline about the 33,000 workers, we first have to look at the foundation of this entire shift. The government has established this core directive. They're calling it the below 5% mandate.
Right, and that mandate is the lens through which every single policy decision over the next 2 years is being filtered.
Every single one.
The central mission here is to bring the temporary resident population, so people who are not permanent residents or citizens, down to below 5% of Canada's total population. And the deadline for that is the end of 2027.
Which is coming up fast. Let's contextualize that math for you listening, because to grasp the gravity of this ambition, you have to look at the demographic reality on the ground.
The hard numbers. Let's look at the Statistics Canada report from October 1st, 2025. The total population was sitting at roughly 41,575,585 people.
Very precise.
Well, the data matters here, and within that total, approximately 2.85 million were non-permanent residents.
Right, so doing the math on that 2.85 million figure, that meant non-permanent residents made up about 6.8% of the total population at that moment in late 2025.
Exactly.
But what's really crucial to note is that 6.8% was already a downward trend. The temporary resident population had actually peaked at 7.6% a year prior in October 2024.
So they were already on a downward trajectory, but the gap they still need to close is just monumental.
It really is. They hit that sub 5% target, assuming the overall Canadian population stays relatively stable. The government basically has to remove roughly 770,000 people from that temporary pool.
I want that to sink in for a second. Removing 770,000 individuals from the national demographic profile is the equivalent of emptying out a major metropolitan area.
It's wild. So how do they actually get there?
The strategy relies entirely on manipulating the flow dynamics. They aren't actively deporting hundreds of thousands of people. Instead, they are strictly controlling the intake.
The inflows.
Right. They've set a hard cap on new temporary arrivals for 2026 at 385,000. By keeping that inflow fiercely restricted, the natural outflows, meaning people whose permits just naturally expire, prompting them to leave, will eventually drain the overall total down.
Inflows have to be kept lower than outflows. But I want to challenge how that 385,000 inflow target is actually sliced up, because this is where the policy hits the pavement for anyone trying to navigate the system right now.
Let's break down those allocations.
Within that 2026 limit, the government carved out 230,000 spots specifically for new temporary workers. And that allocation signals a really profound tension in the strategy.
Oh, absolutely. A massive balancing act.
Right, because on one hand, they are publicly committing to tightening the integrity of the system and slashing numbers, but on the other hand, they know they cannot starve critical sectors of their labor supply.
They'd break the economy. Industries like healthcare, residential construction, and highly specialized rural agriculture are structurally dependent on that international labor pool to function.
Exactly. So that 230,000 allocation for workers is them trying to thread the needle. They want to reduce the overall footprint while keeping the essential economic engines running.
But the direct consequence of protecting that labor supply is that the cuts have to be brutally severe somewhere else. And the demographic absorbing the most impact from this reset is the international student population.
The numbers there are just jarring. For 2026, the target for new student arrivals is strictly capped at 155,000.
Which is a staggering drop when you look back. Under the prior frameworks for 2025, the overall temporary arrival target was north of 673,000.
673,650 to be exact.
Right, with the international student allocation alone sitting way higher. The government is basically cleaving the international student intake in half.
So for prospective students listening to this, or if you have peers hoping to study in Canada, the implications are huge. The era of broad, highly accessible international education in Canada is effectively suspended.
Gaining a student permit in 2026 will be an intensely competitive, highly selective endeavor, and academic institutions that relied heavily on international tuition to subsidize their budgets, they are going to face a severe financial reckoning.
Absolutely. But we also need to be very precise about what these flow targets actually measure, because the government's accounting rules dictate the reality of the policy.
Crucial context right here. That 385,000 inflow cap does not include asylum claimants.
Right, because asylum volume is unpredictable and governed by international treaties, so you can't just package it into an annual quota.
Exactly. Furthermore, the cap excludes seasonal workers, laborers who arrive for the harvest and leave within the exact same calendar year. And perhaps most importantly, it excludes in-Canada extensions.
Yes, that exclusion is a critical technicality. If you are already inside Canada on a student permit and you transition to a post-graduation work permit, you are not counted as a new arrival against that 385,000 cap.
You're already part of the existing 2.85 million stock.
Which brings us perfectly to the most complex and maybe the most controversial element of this whole 2026 to 2028 reset. We have to contrast this sharp reduction in new flows at the border against what they're doing for people already inside the country.
This is where we hit the headline topic of today's analysis.
The contradiction is fascinating. They're slamming the door on hundreds of thousands of new arrivals to ease domestic pressure, but at the exact same time, they're rolling out a one-time initiative to transition 33,000 skilled temporary workers to permanent residents.
With a very heavy emphasis on directing those transitions into rural areas.
Yes, the rural focus is key. But alongside that 33,000 skilled worker transition, there's an even larger parallel initiative happening.
Right. Starting in 2026, the government is going to process 115,000 protected persons, meaning individuals who have already claimed and been granted asylum status into permanent residence over a 2-year period.
Okay, let's test the logic of that strategy for a second, right? The government is mandating a reduction of the temporary population by 770,000 people, because the country supposedly lacks the physical infrastructure to support them.
That's in the narrative.
Yet, they are handing out permanent residency to roughly 148,000 individuals from that very same temporary pool. How does the administration justify that mathematically to a public that is already frustrated by infrastructure strain?
It sounds like a paradox, but the official policy framing explains this through the concept of sustainable stabilization. The overarching goal is to lock permanent resident admissions at exactly 380,000 annually. The strategic pivot here is about changing the source of those permanent residents. Historically, Canada relied heavily on importing massive new cohorts from abroad to hit those targets. Now, the logic is instead of bringing in new people who require entirely new housing and immediate integration services, they fulfill the quotas by elevating those who are already physically here.
Ah, okay. So the rationale is that these 33,000 rural workers and 115,000 protected persons are already renting apartments, they're already integrated into local school systems, and participating in the economy.
Precisely. Transitioning their legal status from temporary to permanent doesn't technically add a single new footprint to the housing market. It just changes their paperwork.
It's a pivot away from an economy reliant on perpetual transient labor, moving toward building a stable workforce out of the inventory of people already established in communities.
And that initiative targeting the 33,000 skilled workers in rural areas is vital. Rural municipalities have historically struggled immensely with immigrant retention.
Because they get PR and immediately move to Toronto or Vancouver.
Exactly. By designing a highly specific transition pathway that rewards temporary workers who have already put down roots in rural sectors, the government is trying to anchor that talent outside of the hyper-congested major urban centers.
But if the overall permanent resident target is flatlining at 380,000, and the temporary arrival pipeline is shrinking drastically, we have to look closely at who is actually being selected moving forward.
Because the pie is shrinking, the criteria for the remaining spots are being fundamentally rewritten.
Which brings us to the February 18th, 2026 announcement by Immigration Minister Lena Metlich-Diab. She detailed this sharpening of the express entry system.
Sharpening is a highly accurate descriptor. The comprehensive ranking system is no longer functioning as a broad net for generalist white-collar professionals.
It is hyper-targeted now.
Very. The newly defined 2026 categories are focused strictly on alleviating acute systemic labor shortages. They are prioritizing researchers, senior managers, and crucially, transport occupations.
Which means a massive glaring spotlight on commercial pilots and aircraft mechanics.
Direct response to the logistical bottlenecks in the aviation sector.
And it goes even further into specialized territory. There is a brand new category specifically designed for skilled foreign military recruits who have secured job offers from the Canadian Armed Forces.
Addressing the historic recruitment crisis within the military.
Exactly. Plus, we're seeing the implementation of the dedicated pathway from December 2025, specifically for international doctors who already possess Canadian medical experience.
But what really demands deep analysis here is how these rigid economic categories intersect with the government's regional and linguistic mandates. Because it isn't just about what you do for a living anymore.
No, it's heavily weighted by the language you speak.
The 2026 plan explicitly engineers a push for Francophone immigration outside of Quebec. They are reserving 5,000 dedicated selection spaces for this.
And they set a hard target for Francophone admissions to account for 9% of all permanent admissions outside Quebec in 2026. Furthermore, they intend to scale that target up to 10.5% by 2028. When you synthesize all of these data points, a very stark reality emerges for you, the listener, if you're navigating this system. The overarching immigration pie is shrinking.
And the slices that remain are not being distributed based on general merit.
Right, they're being deployed as highly targeted economic and demographic tools aimed at critical vulnerabilities, aviation mechanics, military ranks, rural healthcare, while aggressively engineering the Francophone profile of English-majority provinces.
If your specific skills and linguistic profile align with those priorities, your pathway is clear.
But if you fall outside of those narrow parameters, the barrier to entry just became nearly insurmountable.
This rigorous tightening forces us to analyze the catalyst behind the policy. Why execute such a dramatic structural pivot right now?
The driving force behind this entire 2026 to 2028 reset is a profound crisis in public confidence. And it's heavily rooted in the overwhelming strain on local service capacity, specifically the Canadian housing market.
We absolutely cannot analyze Canadian policy in 2026 without centering the housing data.
The societal pressure has reached a boiling point. The federal government was finally forced to publicly connect the arithmetic of their immigration targets with the physical limitations of municipal infrastructure.
Look at the late 2025 real estate data. It tells a highly specific story regarding this shift. The national vacancy rate for purpose-built rentals bumped up to 3.1%.
Now, to a listener in a historically balanced market, 3.1% might still sound incredibly tight. But in the context of the severe scarcity that defined the Canadian rental market over the last decade, that represents a notable and significant loosening of available inventory.
And that loosening is reflecting in pricing metrics. Major national rent trackers like Rentals.ca and Urbanation reported clear year-over-year declines in average asking rents leading into 2026.
Which provides the government with a very potent narrative. The cost of renting, while undeniably still high for the average wage earner, finally began to cool off exactly as the massive population growth of the early 2020s was curtailed.
It's a very clean narrative. Cut the temporary residence, ease the rental demand, lower the cost of living.
Clean, yes. But as analysts, we have to provide the critical caveat to that narrative. Housing affordability is a deeply structural, multifaceted economic issue.
Right, because while drastically limiting immigration eases the immediate demand for shelter, the supply side of the housing equation remains incredibly fragile.
Affordability is fundamentally tied to the rate of new construction completions, the volatility of interest rates, and local job markets.
That is the ultimate blind spot in the demand reduction theory. You can restrict the population growth by 770,000 people to ease the pressure on housing.
But if housing starts plummet simultaneously, because residential construction companies no longer have access to the temporary labor pools they rely on to frame houses and pour concrete grace, you're simply shifting the crisis from the demand side to the supply side.
That tension is the defining vulnerability of this entire policy reset. The government is attempting an incredibly precarious balancing act over the next 2 years. On one side, immense pressure to alleviate the crushing burden on housing and infrastructure.
But on the other side, desperately trying to preserve a functional labor supply. You cannot stabilize a housing crisis if you intentionally starve the construction industry of laborers.
You cannot maintain an aging population if you restrict the influx of healthcare workers.
The initiatives we discussed today, transitioning the 33,000 rural workers and the 115,000 protected persons, sharpening express entry that represents their best attempt to walk that tightrope.
They're hoping to extract the crucial economic utility of these workers without exacerbating the infrastructural strain of importing entirely new populations. It will be a fascinating economic experiment to watch unfold.
Yeah, it really will. That brings us to the end of our analysis for today's deep dive. We've covered a tremendous amount of complex ground, from the mechanics of the below 5% mandate to the ongoing volatility of the housing market.
Our goal is always to synthesize these massive data points into actionable insights for you, helping you understand how these federal changes impact your career and your community.
Before we wrap up, please remember to subscribe, like, and share the deep dive. Your support is what allows us to keep producing this level of analysis. Drop a comment below with your perspective and let us know what critical topics you want us to tackle next.
And once again, if you want to advertise your product to an incredibly engaged audience, reach out to us at deepdive247@gmail.com.
To close out today's deep dive, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to analyze on your own.
We've spent this entire discussion focusing on the brutal economic utility of this new immigration reset the need for doctors, mechanics, agricultural workers.
Right. But if Canada successfully stabilizes its housing market by drastically cutting the temporary resident population by over 770,000 people, how will local businesses and educational institutions that have grown entirely dependent on that temporary labor and international tuition survive the sudden loss?
It is a profound structural question. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.